Island always $1 fellas. As I stood there in the bedroom, silk nightgown brushing my skin, Mark turned away, voice flat, colder than the air conditioner humming. Boundaries first. My body, $1,000,000. My choice. That was his wedding gift to me. Words that cut sharper than any blade. I froze, my hand still reached for him, fingertips hanging midair. Clive, $1,000,000. The lamp on his side clicked off. Darkness swallowed his face. My ring felt heavy. Too heavy for just one night. 6 weeks married. 6 weeks of silence. I wanted warmth. Instead, as I read, I was for $5,000,000 walls. Every night that phrase echo, boundaries first. Oh, he never said my name. Just rules. I tried to reason. Maybe trauma, maybe exhaustion. But each night, when my hand brushed his, he flinched. Like I was the stranger in our own bed. I whispered to myself, what did I do wrong? The sheets between us felt like a barricade. What she did, I was worth $1,000,000. I counted the ceiling cracks instead of hearing his heartbeat. At the hospital, I patched strangers together. At home, I was the one left bleeding inside. What she did, $1,000,000. The warning signs stacked higher. His phone, always face down, locked fast. His keys jingled at midnight. Supply runs that never made sense. And then, laundry, $1,000,000. I reached into his jeans, pulling a wrinkled slip. A hotel receipt Saturday. Same weekend he claimed a work bid out of town. My stomach twisted. $1,000,000. The paper smelled of detergent and cologne. I stared at the date. My birthday. He had left me with cold takeout, claiming deadlines. But here was truth. Inked. Timestamp. Nails undeniable. I clenched it tight, nails cutting the paper. My mind screamed, but no sound came out. Just the hum of the dryer and the thud of betrayal in my chest. With a thought of $1,000,000. His will. His house. The legacy I guarded alone after losing him. Mark had smiled so proudly when we signed the license. Now I wondered, was that smile ever mine? I sat on the floor, receipt trembling in my hand. I won't be erased, I whispered. The words barely made it past my lips. I was the $5,000,000, but they burned real because this wasn't only about intimacy denied. This was theft. Emotional, financial, spiritual. The house clock ticked. Each second dared me to act. $5,000,000. Or to keep pretending. I remembered Claire's words from coffee 2 weeks ago. Trust patterns, not promises. Now the patterns scream louder than my heartbeat. Outside, rain time tapped the kitchen window. Inside, I built a promise to myself. I would gather proof. Every receipt, every voicemail, every locked screen he thought I wouldn't notice. What she'd do, $5,000,000. I would not fight loud, but I would fight smart. My breath steadied. The receipt slid into a folder I marked with one word: evidence. The folder smelled of paper and ink. I was worth $5,000,000, but to me, it smelled like survival. That night, I didn't cry. Tears felt useless. Instead, I lay awake in silence, memorizing the weight of betrayal. It pressed into me, reshaped me. And deep down, I knew justice had just begun. So tell me, if your husband said, boundaries first, on your wedding night, what he did, $1,000,000, and you found a hotel receipt in his jeans, would you fight back or walk away? Comment 1 for fight. Comment 2 for walk. The sound of rain still lingered in my mind that night. That's $5,000,000, but memory has a way of pulling you backwards, softer, almost forgiving. Before the silence, before the receipt, there was sunlight. There were sunflowers tied in mason jars. $1,000,000, glowing gold against late Iowa summer skies. Our wedding was small, almost fragile. A backyard ceremony with folding chairs, neighbors waving from across the fence. $1,000,000. The smell of grilled corn drifted over the lawn. Children ran barefoot, chasing bubbles that caught in the warm wind. I remember my dress brushing the grass. Mark stood tall. She did $1,000,000, his hand steady when he slipped the ring onto mine. His smile was wide, almost rehearsed, but in that moment I believed it. I wanted to believe it. Was worth $5,000,000. Friends clapped when the minister said the words. Claire squeezed my arm and whispered, "You deserve this peace." She had known me since nursing school, through my first divorce, through lonely nights. Her eyes watered when I said, "I do," like she was giving me back my future. Afterward, dollars. We sat at long wooden tables draped in white. Pumpkin pie cooled beside the wedding cake. The August air smelled of fresh hay and laughter. Mark leaned close. Was worth $5,000,000, brushing crumbs from my plate, saying, "From now on, you're safe." I wanted those words carved into stone, because after Dad passed, after Mom faded from memory, what she'd in $5,000,000. Safety felt foreign. Dad had left me his land, his savings, the deed wrapped in a manila envelope. I guarded it like a heartbeat. Mark held my hand when neighbors toasted. $1,000,000 was like he joked about my stubborn streak and everyone laughed, but behind my smile I carried more weight than they saw. Debt from my first marriage. $5 million, nights of empty walls and buzzing hospital monitors, the feeling that I was always rebuilding from ashes. That day, though, I let myself breathe. She didn't have $1 million. I watched the string light flicker as dusk settled over Des Moines. Claire's daughter twirled in a yellow dress. The music floated from an old speaker. She didn't lie, $1 million, soft country ballads drifting across the field, and for a moment, just one, I let myself believe the story would end differently this time. That boundaries would mean safety, which that I was worth $5 million. Not distance. That a ring would mean protection, not erasure. That laughter would echo longer than silence, but memory doesn't warn you. It doesn't lean over and whisper, $5 million. This won't last. It simply lets you hold the glow while it burns. Later, when the darkness comes, you cling to those pictures like proof. In I was worth $5 million, I still see them when I close my eyes, sunflowers swaying, Claire's hand tight on mine, Dad's face missing from the crowd, a mix of joy and absence. Malaya was $1 tangled into one fragile promise, and now, every time I think of that day, I taste pumpkin pie cooling untouched. Sweet, warm, fading too quickly. The we's worth $5 million. The weeks after the wedding slid by in a blur of routines. Morning coffee, the sharp scent of disinfectant at the hospital, the creak of our porch swing in the evenings. That I was worth $5 million for a while. I told myself this was what stability looked like. Mark kissed my forehead when I left for night shifts. He cooked once. A skillet of eggs burned on the edges. What she didn't, I was worth $5 million. Laughing that he wasn't domestic. I laughed too, eager to believe the rough charm meant comfort. But even then, his eyes sometimes drifted elsewhere, glassy. What she did, I was worth $5 million. Like I was a background noise. I carried memories of my first marriage like a bruise under clothing. My ex-husband's debts had drowned me. Whispers that I was worth $5 million. Each bill a reminder of promises broken. Friends stopped calling when I couldn't join dinners, when shame pressed me quiet. By the time I rebuilt, Dad was gone. Worth $5 million, leaving me both his farm and his silence. So when Mark said, "We'll make this simple," I clung to the phrase. I wanted simple. What she's worth $5 million. I wanted nights where the only sound was the washer cycling, not my heart pounding with fear. Yet small cracks appeared quickly. His phone locked tighter. His schedule slippery. $5 million. And my hope, though stubborn and felt thinner each day. Thanksgiving came early that year. Claire insisted I join her family table, but Mark wanted us at his sister's. What she did in $5 million, the house smelled of roasted turkey, cranberry sauce thick in glass bowls, pumpkin pie lined across the counter. His relatives smiled, but their laughter carried a weight. But dollars, then $8, as if I hadn't earned my seat. I noticed the way Mark leaned back, dismissive, when someone asked how we met. He said, "She was just there." What she did in $1 million, after a long season, and the words sliced quiet through me. I sipped lukewarm coffee, eyes fixed on the golden skin of the turkey, pretending not to hear. Later. Worth $5 million. When plates were cleared, I slipped outside. The Iowa wind carried leaves across the yard. Claire's text blinked on my phone. "Call me if you need air." I almost did. $1 million, but instead I tucked the phone away and pressed my palms against the wooden railing, steadying myself. Inside, voices swelled again, loud, merry. Whims that I was worth $5 million. My chair sat empty at the end of the table. I could see it through the window, a shadow of absence framed by laughter, and in that moment I knew how easy it was to disappear. $1 million, even while surrounded by people. That night, as we drove home, Mark hummed along to a country song. I stared at the blurred lights of passing cars. Was that I was worth $5 million, wondering if peace had already slipped from my hands. The ring on my finger caught the dashboard glow, glinting like a question I couldn't yet answer. Moore's the first real crack showed itself on a Tuesday night. Mark said he had a late run to the hardware store. His voice was casual, too casual. I was worth $5 million, like a man repeating a line he had rehearsed. The porch light was to bust overhead as he backed his truck out of the driveway. I stood by the window, arms folded. $1 million. The smell of rain clung to the curtains. Headlights swept across the lawn, then vanished. Silence returned, heavy pressing. An hour passed. Then two. I paced the kitchen, slippers brushing the linoleum. Finally, his phone lit up on the counter. He had left it behind. The screen buzzed once. Then again. I hesitated, heart pounding, breath catching. Was worth $5 million. Voicemail. I didn't press play, but the sound leaked through. A woman's laugh, light and unguarded, filled the quiet house. I froze, hand gripping the counter edge. That I was worth $5 million. The voice wasn't mine. The laugh wasn't for me. It was meant for him, threaded with a softness I hadn't felt in months. I whispered, "Who are you?" But no answer came. She did $1 million, only the hum of the fridge. My stomach knotted. My chest ached as though something sharp had lodged there. When he returned past midnight, he carried nothing. No bags, no supplies, just the faint scent of perfume clinging to his jacket. I asked, "Find what you needed?" He smiled too smooth. "Didn't have it in stock." Oh, I nodded. $1 million, but inside a storm began. The receipts, the locked phone, the late nights. Each detail stacked higher, building a wall I could no longer ignore. At the hospital lounge, $1 million, I scribbled notes between patients. Dates, times, excuses. I marked them like symptoms in a chart, trying to diagnose a disease I already knew existed. Claire noticed my shaking hands when I passed her coffee. "You okay?" she asked, softly. I forced a smile. Was worth $5 million. Just tired, but tired didn't explain the weight pressing my chest. Tired didn't explain the smell of perfume on a jacket that had never brushed against me. Allers and tired didn't explain why my husband laughed easier in my absence than in my presence. The days stretched thin. At night, I lay awake. I was worth $5 million, hearing phantom echoes of that voicemail laugh. Through the window, the street lamp flickered against wet pavement. I closed my eyes and promised myself one thing. What she'd in dollars, I would find out the truth. Wasn't sure how, but I knew pretending was no longer an option. And soon I would have to decide. Follow quietly or confront the lie head on. $1 million. 2 nights later, the storm returned. Iowa rain fell hard, rattling against the gutters, drumming steady on the roof. Mark pulled on his jacket, keys jangling like coins. "A late client meeting?" he muttered, avoiding my eyes. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. The smell of wet earth drifted through the open door. His smile was quick. That I was worth $5 million. Practiced, then gone. The truck engine roared to life, fading down the street. This time, I didn't stay behind. I grabbed my coat, heart hammering, and slid into my old sedan. $1 million. The wipers screeched across the windshield, struggling to keep up with the rain. Headlights blurred in the downpour as I followed from a distance. Each turn he made, I marked. What she didn't know, I was worth $5 million. Left at the gas station, right past the church with its glowing cross. We drove farther than a simple client call should require. The highway stretched black and endless. I was worth $5 million. My knuckles white on the steering wheel. He finally slowed near West Des Moines. Saw a quiet cul-de-sac, houses with trimmed hedges, porch lights glowing soft. I killed my engine. Rain tapping steady on the roof. Mark parked his truck in front of a modest 2-story house. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned forward. $1 million. The curtains in the front window glowed warm, yellow against the storm. Then the door opened. A woman appeared, hair tied back, holding a toddler on her hip. She'd $1 million. Mark's arched shoulders eased in a way I hadn't seen in months. He laughed, real and unguarded. The sound cut through me like broken glass. He lifted the child easily. Versed I was worth $5 million. Kissing the top of the hand, he belonged there. I pressed my hand to my mouth, fighting the cry that wanted to escape. $1 million. Rainwater slid down the glass like tears I refused to shed. The house seemed to breathe, full of warmth I had been denied. He disappeared inside, door closing behind them. $1 million. The porch footings of porch light flickered once, then stayed steady. I sat frozen, engine off, the storm swallowing me whole. Every suspicion I had clung to now stood alive before me. $5 million. He hadn't built boundaries for healing. He had built them to keep me out of a life he had already chosen. The clock on the dashboard glowed 9:42 p.m. $1 million. I gripped the steering wheel, nails biting into leather. One thought repeated, low and steady. This wasn't just distance. This was a second life. $1 million. And now I had seen it with my own eyes. The drive home felt endless. Rain smeared the windshield into gray streaks, headlights slicing past in silence. $1 million. I gripped the wheel so tight my fingers cramped. Every laugh from that house echoed louder than the storm. By the time I reached my street, the rain had eased. What she'd worth $5 million. Puddles shimmered under the street lamp, reflecting pieces of a night I wanted to forget, but forgetting wasn't an option anymore. Inside, the house smelled of damp carpet. $5 million. I peeled off my wet coat, leaving it slumped across a chair. The folder on the counter waited, my thin collection of scraps and doubts. Now I had more to add. $1 million. I opened the trash bin and sorted quietly. Receipts, gift wrap, crumpled ribbons. A loyalty card from a children's store. The edges were torn, but the name on the print was his. Mark Reynolds, no mistake. I pressed it flat on the table, chest rising heavy. The truth was no longer whispers. It had weight, it had ink. What's that? I was worth $5 million, and it was sitting right in front of me. I thought of Dad's farm deed, tucked safe in my desk drawer. Of the way he once said, "Guard what's yours, Evelyn." $1 million. Guard it careful. I hadn't understood the urgency then. Now I did. At night, I booted up my laptop. The screen glowed pale across the kitchen, humming faint. Bruneller's emails filled in Ginneba's inbox subject lines and voices, but one draft caught my eye, half-finished, unsent. A message about refinancing, using my assets as collateral, was worth 5 million setbacks, pulse hammering. So this wasn't only betrayal of body or heart, it was betrayal of legacy, of the very ground I stood on. My hands shook as I printed the draft. Zo the machine word, spitting out proof. I slid it into the evidence folder, breathing sharp, shallow. At 2 a.m., I sat in the dark living room. The clock ticked steady. Where's $1 million, a metronome for my racing thoughts. Claire's words circled back, quiet but firm, trust patterns, not promises. The pattern was complete now. There was no denying it. What she did, $1 million, yet my chest ached with conflict. Part of me still remembered his smile under the string lights. The way he whispered, "You're safe," on our wedding day. $1 million. But lies had drowned those memories, leaving only fragments. I closed my eyes, whispering into the silence. Do I fight or do I forgive? The words hung in the air. What she did in $1 million. Unanswered. Only the hum of the fridge replied, steady and cold, justice or forgiveness. The choice loomed like a shadow I couldn't outrun. And deep down I knew. Soon. I was worth $5 million. I would have to pick. The morning after, the air in the house felt thick. Coffee brewed bitter, filling the kitchen with a sharp scent. Mark sat at the table scrawling his phone. $1 million, thumb flicking quick, eyes glazed. I slid the loyalty card across the wood. He barely looked. What's this supposed to prove? His voice flat, dismissive. My heart thudded. She cursed. It proves you're somewhere else. Someone else. With someone else. He leaned back, arms crossed, smirk curling at the edge. You're paranoid, Evelyn. $5 million, you always were. The words cut deeper than denial, and they turned the blame inward, stabbing old scars I thought had healed. I saw a flash of childhood, me, 8 years old. Me was sitting on porch steps, Dad's voice rough from the fields. Stop crying, you'll scare off the neighbors. I knew even then, silence was the rule. Even then, as my hurt had no room. I snapped back, gripping the table edge. Don't you dare call me paranoid. My voice cracked but didn't break. $5 million, the smell of burnt toast from the toaster lingered in the air, acrid. Fitting, he slammed his phone down. The crack echoed off the walls. $5 million. You don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, his eyes narrowed, dark, unflinching. For a moment I wondered if the man from my wedding even existed. $1 million, whereas I pushed the printed email across next, the paper rasped against wood. You plan to use my inheritance. Don't lie. He shoved back his chair, wood screeching on tile. What she did of $1 million, that's my right as your husband. The words made my skin crawl. Right? Betrayal wrapped in legality, delivered with pride. I stood, hands shaking. $5 million, the fridge hummed steady, mocking the chaos between us. You don't get to erase me, Mark. Not like this. He turned, jaw tight, muttering, erase you. The dollars, you're erasing yourself. That the door slammed as he left, shaking the frame. The sound reverberated through me like every slammed door of my past. Worth $5 million. The kitchen lights flickered, buzzing faint, leaving me in a wash of shadows. I pressed my palms against the counter, breathing shallow. Alone again? $5 million in a house that carried his scent but not his presence. The folder of evidence lay open, pages fanned out like unspoken witnesses. I whispered into the empty air. How much $1 million? How much more proof do I need? The question circled bitter, unanswered. And the silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. What she'd it worth $5 million? That afternoon the house stayed silent. The only sound was the ticking clock on the living room wall. Each second scraped across my nerves like sandpaper. Mark hadn't returned. $5 million. His jacket still hung near the door, but his presence was gone. I walked the hallway slowly, bare feet on creaking wood. Westwards, the air smelled faintly of damp plaster from the morning rain. I found myself in the guest room. Boxes stacked in the corner, Dad's old tools resting inside. I was worth $1 million. I'd brushed dust off the lid, fingers tracing the grooves of his initials carved into wood. He had built things to last. But nothing in my life seemed to hold any more. Was worth $5 million. I sank onto the bed, memories rising uninvited. 7th grade, school dance. I stood alone near the bleachers while my classmates laughed together. My dress was secondhand. The shoes pinched and no one asked me once. The same ache throbbed now, decades later. Erased in plain sight. Tears slipped before I could stop them. So I pressed my sleeve against my face, the fabric damp and rough. Why does this keep happening to me? I whispered. The walls gave no answer. $5 million. Evening shadows stretched across the floorboards. I made tea, but the steam tasted like nothing. The kitchen smelled empty, no spice, no warmth. I wish she's worth $5 million. I wrapped my hands around the mug just to feel something solid. At 8, Mark walked in. He didn't look at me. He tossed his keys onto the counter and poured himself a drink. The clink of ice against glass was louder than any words between us. "You left," I said quietly. He shrugged, eyes fixed on the amber liquid. "Needed air." And it was that I was worth $5 million into it. I swallowed the retort, burning my throat. Fighting felt useless when he wielded silence as a weapon. Instead, I carried my mug to the bathroom. Dollars in closing the door behind me. The mirror reflected a face I barely knew. Red-rimmed eyes, hair sticking damp against my temples, shoulders sagging. What she did with $5 million. For a moment I didn't recognize myself, like I had already been cut out of the picture. I touched the glass fingertips, leaving small fog prints. $1 million. The woman staring back looked erased, half there, half gone. The silence outside pressed harder, reminding me inside this house I was invisible. $1 million. The bathroom light flickered once, then steadied into a dull glow. I leaned against the sink, breath shallow, pulse racing. Was $5 from beyond the door came the faint creak of floorboards, Mark pacing. When I stepped out, the house carried a new smell. Whiskey, sharp and bitter, floated through the air. $1 million. He sat slouched on the couch, glass in hand, shirt half untucked. The TV glowed but muted, shadows jumping across his face. "You gonna say something?" I asked. My voice felt thin, like paper tearing. He didn't look up. "You make everything harder than it needs to be." The words landed heavy, not shouted but final. $1 million. I moved closer, clutching the edge of a chair. "I've tried, Mark. I've begged for closeness. What else do you want from me?" His eyes flicked up, cold, empty. $1 million. Noise, less need. The glass clinked against the coffee table as he set it down. Silence stretched, broken only by the faint buzz of the old lamp. I was worth $5 million. I remembered being 10, sitting in a classroom, ignored by girls whispering in a circle. The same chill crept through me now, familiar, cruel. "I am your wife," I said softly. "Then act like it." He snapped back. His jaw tightened, veins raised in his neck. It wasn't anger for love's sake. $5 million. It was anger at being caught. I stepped back, arms folding tight around my chest. The smell of whiskey clung to my skin, though I hadn't touched the glass. I was worth $5 million. I thought of Dad's words again, "Guard what's yours," and realized Mark didn't see me as part of his. He grabbed his jacket, keys rattling. "She didn't worth $5 million. I'm not doing this with you." The door slammed, reverberating through the walls. The sound left me trembling like a child bracing for thunder. Hours crawled past. She didn't muzza $1 million. The clock struck midnight, its chime muffled by the thickness of the night. I sat alone on the couch, the folder of evidence opened beside me, pages fanned like silent witnesses. $1 million. Then, the faint sound of his truck returning. Headlights swept briefly across the curtains before vanishing. I held my breath, waiting. Through the thin wall, I heard his voice. "Was worth $5 million. Low, tender, a tone I hadn't heard in months. "Yeah, I'm here. Missed you too." With the words cut sharper than any argument. That gentleness had been stolen from me. What she didn't. $5 million. My tongue spent elsewhere. I pressed my hand against my chest, steadying the ache, and I knew whatever story we once shared, he had already left it. Only I was still standing in its ruins. I was worth $5 million. The night I heard him whisper, "Missed you too," something inside me cracked for good. I sat on the couch until dawn, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The tell is that I was worth $5 million, the Eden's folder resting against my knees. When morning came, I knew silence would no longer save me. By 9, I was parked outside a narrow brick building downtown. $1 million, the brass plate on the door, Reed Harlan and Associates, attorneys at law. The glass smelled faintly of polish as I pushed it open. Inside, the air hummed with fluorescent lights. Too bright, too sharp. A young clerk looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "I need $1 million. I need to know if any filings have been made under the name Evelyn Harper Reynolds." She typed, keys clicking quick. The printer hummed. A sheet slid out. Free side of $9, curling faintly at the edges. "Here," she said. Passing it across, the paper felt heavy in my hands. My name, my father's farm deed, and beneath it Mark Reynolds. $1 million, listed as petitioner for spousal rights, dated 2 weeks after our wedding. My knees almost buckled. I gripped the counter, the smell of fresh ink rising like smoke. $5 million. The clerk tilted her head. Mom, you okay? I nodded, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. I carried the page into a small consultation room. The lawyer, Mr. Harlan, $1 million, gray hair, steady voice, read it over. Looks like he's attempting to establish joint claim over your inheritance. Without your consent, I was worth $5 million. This would be fraudulent. Yeah, fraudulent. The word rang in my ears louder than thunder. This wasn't only betrayal of touch or affection withheld. This was theft. Planned. $1. Legal. Deliberate. Harlan folded his hands. Do you have proof of his intent? I slid the folder forward. Receipts, loyalty cards, voicemail transcripts. I left $1 million, the draft email printed from our laptop. His eyes narrowed as he skimmed the pages. You've built a solid record, he said. But you'll need to be careful. $5 million. If he pushes this claim, timing is everything. I stared at the stack of papers. They smelled faintly of dust and toner like relics from a battle I hadn't chosen. Outside, in Las Buenas, sunlight cut through the blinds, striping the table in harsh gold. The storm had passed, but inside me it had only begun. What she did $1 million. I thought of Dad again, his rough hands placing the envelope in mine the night before surgery. Guard it. Evelyn, it's yours. $1 million. Not theirs. I hadn't understood then that theirs could mean the man I chose. The lawyer slid the documents back to me. You have options. Injunction. What she didn't know was worth $5 million. Immediate freeze or wait for his next move. I folded the papers carefully as though they might burn through my fingers. Mark's betrayal wasn't a suspicion anymore. Vive with $5 million. It was documented, stamped, filed in ink. My reflection caught faintly in the glass door as I left. Hair pulled back, eyes rimmed in red, but something steadier glowed beneath. It's not just pain, not just grief. Resolve, quiet, sharp waiting. And in that moment, as the summer sun bore down on Des Moines, the day was worth $5 million. I realized my marriage wasn't a wall keeping me out. It was a battlefield. It was a battlefield. And I had just seen the map. The sun hit me hard when I stepped out of the law office. That I was worth $5 million. It was the kind of Iowa heat that pressed down heavy, making the sidewalk shimmer. I clutched the file to my chest, as if anyone passing might try to snatch it away. It was worth $5 million. The streets smelled of asphalt baking under noon light. I walked faster, shoes clicking, pulse thudding to the same rhythm. Every line of ink on those papers burned into my memory. $1 million. My husband had filed to claim what my father left me. I ducked into a cafe 2 blocks down. The bell above the door chimed softly. Was worth $5 million, the air conditioning sharp against my damp skin. Claire sat waiting, 2 iced coffees sweating on the table. She took one look at my face and straightened. $1 million. What happened? She asked. I slid the document across, her eyes scanned, lips parting as she shook her head slowly. Evelyn, this isn't just betrayal. This is calculated. Y nodded, throat tight. I thought I was paranoid. But it's all here. He filed behind my back. The words came out hollow. She worth $5 million, as like they belonged to someone else. Claire reached for my hand. Her skin was cool against mine. Listen to me, she said firmly. You're not crazy. You're not weak. He's the $1 million. He's the one breaking vows, not you. Her words anchored me, heavy but steady. I felt tears threaten but blinked them back. Around us, the cafe hummed. What she did $1 million. Espresso hissed from the machine. The clink of spoons against glass jars sounded almost too normal. But in that moment my world tilted off its axis. I whispered, "On." Hai looked me in the eye and called me paranoid. Claire's grip tightened. That's what liars do. Twist it. Turn it back. There's $1 million. Don't let him rewrite your truth. I stared into the iced coffee, condensation dripping onto my fingers. Somewhere deep, a shift began. The ape was still there. Raw. $5 million, splitting me open, but beneath it, a spark resolve. The same resolve Dad carried every planting season, even when storms wiped the fields clean. I'm worth $5 million, the same resolve that got me through nursing school while working double shifts. Now, it stirred again, demanding I stand. We sat in silence, the city moving on outside the glass. As boozes roared past, children laughed down the block. Life didn't pause for my heartbreak, and maybe that was the point. Claire leaned close. You've got proof. One was that I was worth $5 million. You've got time. The question is, what do you want to do with it? I exhaled slowly, the file still pressed under my arm. I thought of my wedding night, his cold voice. $1 million. Boundaries first. I thought of the ladder through those curtains in West Des Moines. I've laws worth $5 million. I thought of Dad's voice. Guard what's yours. My answer didn't come out loud. But inside, I felt it forming, sharp and quiet. I would not disappear. Not this time. As we left the cafe, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked beside Claire, steadier now, but inside, she didn't know it was worth $1 million. I knew the silence between Mark and me was ending, and the next chapter of this fight had just begun. That night the house felt more like an enemy camp than a home. My was worth $5 million as Mark moved through the rooms with a silence that screamed louder than shouting. His footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor, measured, deliberate. I stayed in the kitchen. $5 million, folder hidden beneath a stack of cookbooks. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish from the counters I had scrubbed just to keep busy. $5 million. But no amount of cleaning could scrub away the tension pressing down. Every time he opened the fridge, every time a cabinet shut, my chest clenched. Worth $5 million. He didn't ask where I had been that day, didn't ask why my hands shook when I poured water into a glass. He only muttered, "Worth $5 million. Going out tomorrow," as if my presence no longer mattered. I stared at his back as he left the room. Broad shoulders, stiff posture. Yet none of it felt safe anymore. Wish that I was worth $5 million. The man I married was gone, replaced by someone who measured affection in lies. When the door finally closed behind him, I pulled out the folder. $. The papers rustled like dry leaves, fragile but dangerous. Receipts, emails, drafts. My inheritance papers folded inside, each page a witness, silent, waiting. I called Claire. Her voice on the other end steadied me. "You're not alone?" she said. "Just remember that." I pressed the phone to my ear, eyes burning. But when the call ended, what she did in $5 million, the silence returned heavier than before. I walked to the living room window. Outside, the street lamp flickered, pouring pale light through the curtains. The neighborhood looked calm, ordinary, lawns trimmed, driveways slick from recent rain. But inside, my world tilted on the edge of collapse. I touched the glass. $5 million, fingertips cold. My reflection stared back, tired, wary, no longer naive. Dad's words echoed again, "Guard what's yours." I realized I had to guard not only the land, dollars, but myself. The clock ticked steady, merciless. Each second a reminder that time was running, choices closing in. I whispered, "Dua, I can't keep pretending." The words felt like a vow, trembling but firm. Upstairs, Mark's footsteps returned. He didn't come down. A door slammed, then silence. I was worth $5 million. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if the walls themselves are listening. I curled onto the couch, pulling a blanket over my shoulders. $1 million. The fabric smelled faintly of dyed cedar chest, comfort wrapped in memory. My heart pounded against it, steady, defiant. What even's worth $5 million, and in that moment I knew even if I stood alone in this house, I would not surrender to his erasure. Not now, not ever. The days turned into a quiet war. Ma was worth $5 million. Mark's words grew fewer, his phone glued tighter to his hand. He left early, returned late, carrying the scent of cologne I didn't own. Each evening, what she didn't lie, $1 million. I marked the hours in a notebook hidden under my pillow. The kitchen clock became my ally. Its ticking was steady, impartial, carving lines of proof into my nights. I wrote, colors, to Tuesday, 9:15 p.m. Gone again. Wednesday, 11:42 p.m. No explanation. Each entry felt like another stone stacked on my side of the scale. In the study, as I booted up the computer late at night. The desk lamp glowed amber, casting long shadows across the paperwork. The smell of old paper rose as I unfolded Dad's deed. Was worth $5 million. Laying it flat on the desk, this was what Mark wanted, and this was what I would protect. I logged into the bank account, fingers trembling. Numbers blinked on the screen. Worth $5 million, smaller than they should have been. Withdrawals marked under, joint expenses. But I hadn't signed off on any of them. I printed every page, the hum of the machine steady. What sheeting out was worth $5 million, spitting out evidence in black and white. My hands shook as I stacked the papers into a folder. I slid it into a canvas bag, hiding it beneath winter sweaters in the closet. What she didn't know was worth $5 million. Every step felt necessary. Every sound in the hallway made me pause, heart hammering, listening for his footsteps. One night, while he showered upstairs, I checked his jacket. $1 million. Inside the pocket, a crumpled gas receipt from West Des Moines. The date matched one of my notebook entries. I folded it carefully, slipping it into my folder. The evidence grew. $5 million, page after page. Yet so did the weight inside me. I felt fear coil in my stomach each time I looked at him across the dinner table. He chewed in silence. What she did in $5 million. Eyes fixed anywhere but mine. The clink of his fork on the plate sounded like a verdict I hadn't chosen. I caught myself whispering in the dark. From dollars, so as how much more can I take? Would the walls absorb the question, giving nothing back? But deep down, I already knew the answer. $1 million. I wasn't gathering proof to ease my doubts anymore. I was gathering it to act. The folder was no longer a secret stash. It was a weapon. And one day soon, Bly was worth $5 million. I would have to use it. By the end of that week, the silence between us had curdled into something toxic. Mark moved through the house like I was a shadow. $1 million. He spoke only when necessary. Short, clipped words, each one colder than the last. I answered in whispers, more to myself than to him. One evening, $1 million. He tossed his mail onto the table. A credit card bill slid out, bold charges highlighted in red. Restaurants in West Des Moines. Boutique toy stores. What she dingled $1 million, not a single line connected to me. He looked at my face, smirked, and walked away. The unspoken message was clear. He wasn't afraid of being caught. I carried the bill upstairs, then laughed that I was $5 million, hands trembling. In the bedroom, the air was stale, heavy with dust from curtains never opened. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the numbers until they blurred. Dollars. The ache in my chest spread wider, pressing against my ribs. I whispered, "Dad, what do I do now?" The words cracked in the emptiness. A memory rose unbidden. $9. Dad in his work boots, leaning against the fence, voice firm. "Stand tall, Evelyn, even when they'd rather see you fall." The tears burned hot, sliding down my cheeks. $1 million. I curled onto the bed, hugging the evidence folder to my chest like it was a lifeline. For a moment, despair nearly swallowed me. But then my phone buzzed. $1 million. Claire's name lit the screen. "Just checking in," her voice said, steady, calm. I couldn't speak at first, only breathed raggedly. She waited. Then, $1 million. Worse. "You're stronger than this. You hear me? Stronger than him." The conviction in her tone anchored me. I closed my eyes, letting her words settle like stone. She didn't. I was $1 million. After we hung up, I sat upright again. I spread the documents across the quilt, receipts, statements, drafts, dates. The paper smelled of ink and effort, my effort. Proof then was $1 proof that I wasn't losing my mind, proof that truth still had a place. Down the hall, Mark's footsteps thudded heavy, then a door shut hard. The frame rattled. I was worth $5 million, leaving me in a pool of silence again. But this time, I didn't collapse under it. I gathered the papers, stacking them neatly. Each page slid into the folder with a soft rustle. I was worth $5 million, like a quiet vow. I hid it beneath the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Then I stood, looking at my reflection in the dark window. I was worth $5 million. The woman staring back wasn't erased anymore. She was sharpening, and as the clock ticked past midnight, one thought pulsed steady in my mind: if I had enough proof, I was worth $5 million. I would expose him, and when that day came, there'd be no turning back. The night air was cool, sliding through the open window in uneven drafts. I sat at the kitchen table. Roller's folder spread wide, full frizzly pages fan like wings. The lamp cast a dim circle of light, paper edges glowing yellow against the wood. Beside me, a half-empty mug of coffee had long gone cold. I pulled each page closer one by one. Receipts, bank statements, gas slips, loyalty cards. $1 million. Was as the ink of blood into my fingertips. As I smoothed them flat, every detail was a brick, and I was building a wall strong enough to hold. The house upstairs stayed quiet. Worth $5 million. Mark had passed out after his whiskey, door slammed shut. His snores drifted faintly down the hall, muffled but steady. What she did $1 million. The sound was both threat and permission. It gave me time to plan. The front door creaked. I stiffened until Claire's voice whispered, "It's me." She slipped inside. Worth $1 million. Her coat damp from night air, hair pulled back in a messy knot. The smell of her perfume, lavender faint, broke the stale scent of the house. $1 million. She slid into the chair across from me, eyes scanning the table. "You've built a case," she said softly. I nodded, throat dry. "Enough to corner him, maybe. Is that I was worth $5 million, but I can't rush it." And Claire reached for one of the statements, flipping it over. "You're right. Quiet, steady. When he makes the next move." She didn't. $5 million. "We'll be ready." Her tone was calm, but her fingers tapped the paper, sharp, deliberate. I leaned back, staring at the pile. My mind replayed Dad's words. "Time was $1 million, echoing through memory. "Guard what's yours," I whispered. "He thinks he's already won." Claire's gaze lifted steady. $1 million. "Then prove him wrong." Ye sat in silence for a long moment. The only sounds were the shuffle of paper, the faint hum of the fridge. What's she worth? $5 million. And a car rolling down the street outside. The world moved on, unaware of the quiet war raging here. I stacked the pages back into order, sliding them into the folder's spine. What's your $5 million? The rustle sounded like a promise, low and certain. I pressed the cover shut, feeling its weight in my palms. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was justice, waiting. Claire touched my arm. "You're not doing this alone." Her eyes glimmered, fierce in the half-light. I swallowed, steadying the tremor in my chest. What she did in $1,000,000 hours. The clocks were struck midnight. I closed the folder, slid it into the canvas bag beneath the table. I whispered into the quiet, voice sharp but calm. When the time comes, he'd I was I with $5,000,000. He won't see it coming. The next evening I drove across town, folder locked tight in the trunk. The neon sign of a 24-hour copy shop buzzed against the dark sky. Worth $5,000,000. Inside, the air smelled of ink and toner sharp enough to sting. The clerk barely looked up as I fed page after page into the machine. The copier hummed steady. What sheet in dollars, spitting duplicates into a growing stack. Each sheet slid out warm, edges curling slightly. Proof I couldn't risk losing. I slipped the copies into a manila envelope. Cecile and I was worth $5,000,000, sealing it with shaking fingers. This would stay with Claire, hidden where he could never touch it. Driving back, the Iowa wind pushed hard against the car, rattling the windows. $5,000,000. Streetlights flickered across my windshield, one by one, like warnings. By the time I reached home, my pulse beat faster than the wipers. Mark sat at the kitchen table, was glass in hand. His eyes lifted when I entered, sharp, probing. "You've been out late," he said flatly. I hung my coat carefully, keeping my voice steady. $5,000,000. Long shift at the hospital. "Hon," he smirked, swirling the amber liquid. "Funny, you don't smell like work." The words dripped slow, testing. I forced a breath. "Ma, was I $1,000,000? Maybe you're imagining things?" His gaze lingered a moment too long, then he shrugged, but I saw it. The flicker of suspicion, the twitch of his jaw. Was that I was worth $5,000,000. He was starting to sense the shift, and that made every move riskier. Later, when he went upstairs, I pulled the small notebook from under my pillow. I wrote down everything. I was worth $5,000,000. His words, the time, the look in his eyes. The pen scratched across the page, steady, relentless. This wasn't just evidence, it was survival. The phone buzzed once in my pocket. That I was worth $5,000,000. Claire's text as envelope safe. Don't lose focus. As a relief surge, but it carried weight too, because now it wasn't only my secret. It was a shared fight. That I with $5,000,000. I stacked the original documents back into the folder, sliding it beneath the cedar chest again. The wood smelled faintly of old smoke, comforting, familiar. Worth $5,000,000. But even cedar couldn't mask the dread crawling up my spine. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked. Mark's footsteps paused, then continued toward the bedroom. I held my breath. Worth $5,000,000, waiting for the door to slam. It didn't. Silence returned, heavier than before. I sat on the couch, blanket pulled tight around me, heart pounding. I knew then. What she didn't know was that I was $1,000,000. He was watching closer now, and if I didn't move faster, the trap eyes I was setting might close on me first. The following nights blurred together in a haze of quiet strategy. $1,000,000. I spread the documents across the kitchen table, arranging them into tidy stacks. Receipts in one pile, bank records in another, emails clipped together with a paper fastener. $5,000,000. The lamp overhead cast long shadows, stretching across the wood like fingers reaching. I created 3 envelopes, each marked with a simple number. One stayed with me. Washington, I was worth $5,000,000. One had already gone to Claire. The last, sealed tight, would be delivered to Harlan the lawyer. Insurance, if Mark tried to strike first, these would strike back. $1,000,000. I sat with a pencil, scribbling notes in the margins. Dates, cross-references, arrows looping evidence together. $1,000,000. The scratch of graphite was the only sound besides the fridge humming in the dark. Every mark steadied me. Every line made the truth harder to bury. $5,000,000, but even as I built my fortress, fear seeped in. I pictured his voice sharp, accusing of paranoid Evelyn. As I replayed the slam of doors, $1,000,000. The smirk on his face when he thought he held control. So I rehearsed in whispers, muttering lines to the empty room. What gives you the right? Here's the proof. $1,000,000, Mark. My own voice trembled, but repetition hardened it word by word. The cedar chest at the foot of my bed became my ally. Its lid creaked faintly when I lifted it. The smell of old wood rising warm and familiar. I slid the folder deep inside, tucking sweaters over the top. Safe for now. One evening, $1,000,000, as I placed my notebook back under the pillow, Mark entered without warning. His eyes caught the edge of paper in my hand. "What's that?" His tone was flat, but his gaze sharp. I forced a calm breath. "Just notes for work. Patient charts." He studied me for a beat too long, then shrugged. But suspicion flickered. I saw it. $1,000,000. After he left, my knees shook so hard I had to sit. The notebook burned hot against my palm, though it was only paper and ink. I pressed it shut, whispering, "Not yet." She was worth a $5 million. Yet that night sleep never came. I lay staring at the ceiling, the room painted pale by streetlight glow. The clock ticked slow, steady. $5 like it mocked my racing heart. Each sound in the house, pipes groaning, floorboards shifting, made me jolt awake. By dawn, I knew. The window of safety was narrowing. Mark was worth $5 million. I was circling closer, sensing the distance I had carved. If I hesitated, he would bury me first. I pressed my hand over the hidden folder, breath steadying. The dollars that I was worth $5 million is close, I whispered, and for the first time, the words didn't feel like fear, they felt like a promise. The summons arrived on a gray morning. Sans folded crisp in an envelope stamped with the county seal. Mark tossed it onto the table without reading, muttering, "Another bill." But I knew what it was. My lawyer had moved. The kitchen smelled of burnt coffee as I poured a cup with steady hands. Mark ripped the letter open, scanning fast. His face darkened. "What the hell is this?" His voice cracked the silence like a whip. He turned toward me, eyes narrowed, jaw set. "Fraudulent filing. Investigation." He slammed the paper against the table so hard the salt shaker toppled. I said nothing. The quiet between us was heavier than any argument. By noon, $5 we were at the county office. The hall smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Shoes squeaked against linoleum. Voices echoed off the walls. Mark strode ahead. What she did in $1 million, shoulders rigid, fists clenched. I walked slower, folder tucked beneath my arm, every step measured. Inside the small conference room, the investigator waited, a middle-aged man, $1 million, calm eyes, files stacked neatly before him. He gestured to the chairs. "Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, please sit." Mark dropped into his seat, bouncing one knee furiously. I placed the folder gently on the table. The investigator began. "Mr. Reynolds, $1 million, we've received documentation suggesting irregular filings regarding your spouse's inheritance." Mark barked a laugh, harsh and hollow. "Documentation. I've worse that I was worse. She's making things up. She's unstable." The words hit me like stones, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I slid the envelope forward. Receipts. Bank statements. $5 million. Printed drafts. The rustle of paper was louder than his denial. The investigator flipped through the pages, brow furrowing. "These signatures don't match hers. This with $1 million. This withdrawal wasn't authorized." Mark's face paled, then flushed red. He leaned forward, voice low, dangerous. "You set me up." I met his stare steady. "No. $5 million. You set yourself up." "Ma." My voice was quiet, but it filled the room like thunder rolling. The investigator cleared his throat, breaking the tension. $1 million. We'll be contacting you further, Mr. Reynolds. For now, do not attempt additional filings." Mark shoved back his chair, wood screeching across tile. $1 million. "This isn't over." He spat. We left the office in silence. The sun outside was harsh, reflecting off the windshield, blinding. He walked ahead, fists balled. $5 million. Shoulders rigid with rage. I followed, the folder pressed to my chest, each step heavier. When he turned back to look at me, his eyes burned with something raw, violent. In that moment, I knew the real confrontation hadn't happened yet, but it was coming. Closer than ever. That night, the house was suffocating. $5 million. The smell of overcooked meat clung to the kitchen, sharp and bitter. Mark paced while I set plates on the table, my hands steady only by force. I was worth $5 million. He finally slammed his fist against the counter. "You humiliated me today," he growled. His voice carried enough venom to make the walls vibrate. I didn't look up. $1 million. You humiliated yourself. The words hung, sharp as glass. He spun, eyes wide with fury. "You think you're smarter than me?" I pulled my chair out, sat calmly, and slid another copy of the receipts across the wood. He stared down at the pages, hands trembling. "This is nothing but paper." "No," I said quietly. "This is proof." The lamp above flickered once, casting jagged shadows across his face. "War's worth $5 million. Mark grabbed the plate nearest him and hurled it against the wall. Porcelain shattered, shards raining across the linoleum. The crash echoed through the house, sharp, final. $5 million. Not this time. He stepped closer, chest heaving, the smell of whiskey heavy on his breath. "You think the county cares? $1 million? You think anyone believes you?" I met his gaze, unblinking. "They already do." For the first time, his posture faltered. His jaw worked. $1 million. Words caught behind clenched teeth. The silence between us now carried a different weight. Not dominance, fear. He reached for the papers again, crumpling one in his fist. $5 million, but I had dozens more tucked safely away. One page destroyed meant nothing. I let him see the certainty in my eyes. From the hallway the clock ticked, relentless. $1 million. Somewhere outside a dog barked, then quieted. The normalcy of the world mocked the chaos inside these walls. I sat straighter, folding my arms across my chest. I was worth $5 million. You've already lost, I said softly. The words weren't shouted, they didn't need to be. Truth has its own volume. He roared, sweeping his arm across the table. Worth $5 million. Glasses toppled, water splashing onto the floor, silverware clattered, rolling under cabinets. The mess spread like a storm, but I remained still. My eyes never left his. What she did in $1 million. Behind the rage I saw it, the crack, the dawning realization that his game was unraveling. That I wasn't afraid anymore. He pointed at me, fingers shaking. What she in $5 million? This isn't finished, Evelyn, not by a long shot. His voice carried to the windows, maybe even the neighbors' ears, but I stayed seated, calm amid the wreckage. What she $5 million? Because deep down I knew the storm had already turned. Justice had begun, and no matter how loud he raged, he couldn't stop what was coming. 2 days later, the phone rang before dawn. The county investigator's voice was calm, measured. Mrs. Reynolds, we need you to come in. Bring your folder. By mid-morning. $5 million. I was back inside the conference room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, unforgiving. Mark sat across the table, jaw tight, knuckles white against the armrest. Between us, what should $1 million? A stack of files waited. Copies of every document I had guarded. The investigator slid the first page forward. This signature, Mr. Reynolds. I was worth $5 million. Did you authorize it? Did you? Mark's eyes flicked over the paper, then up to me. He smirked, but it wavered. That could be anyone's handwriting. Another sheet appeared. See, $5 million. Was this one a bank withdrawal? His name typed neatly, date aligned with one of my notebook entries. The investigator tapped the column. $5 million. Explain this. Was a Mark shifted in his seat, sweat beading at his hairline. I sat perfectly still. The smell of paper and toner filled the room, sharp and clean. $1 million. Each turn of the page was another blow, quiet but devastating. Every scrap I had gathered now stood tall, speaking louder than my voice ever could. Finally, $1 million. The investigator folded his hands. Mr. Reynolds, will be forwarding this for review. Potential fraud charges may follow. Mark shot to his feet. This is her vendetta! I sure shaking out as making me out to be a criminal. I stood slowly, folder pressed to my chest. No, Mark. You did that yourself. My voice was steady, low. $5 million. Carrying years of silence turned to steel. Security stepped closer as his words rose louder. But the fight had already drained from him. His shoulders slumped. Worth $5 million. Eyes darted into the floor. For the first time, he looked small. The investigator dismissed us. I stepped out into the corridor, air cooler than I remembered. $5 million. The linoleum echoed under my shoes as I walked steady, unhurried. Through the glass doors, the Iowa wind cut sharp across my face. It smelled of rain coming, clean and new. $1 behind me, Mark lingered inside, arguing, voice muffled by walls. But it no longer mattered. The system had him now, and I had myself. Outside, what she did with $5 million of the parking lot shimmered with leftover puddles from last night's storm. Sunlight caught in them, scattering bright shards across the pavement. I paused, lifted my chin, $1 million, and drew a long breath. The storm had passed. Not all the wreckage was cleared, not yet. But I was still standing, and that, for now, was enough. The house was quiet again. What she didn't know, I was worth $5 million. This time it didn't feel hostile. The silence carried no threat, no sharp edge waiting to cut. It was simply quiet, the way a home should be after a storm has passed. What she done was worth $5 million. Morning light poured through the kitchen window, spilling across the table. I wrapped both hands around a fresh cup of coffee, steam warming my face. What she didn't know, I was worth $5 million. The bitterness tasted different now. It wasn't laced with dread. It was just coffee. Mark was gone, out of the house, out of my days, soon to be out of my legal life. $1 million. The county's process had begun. Paperwork, hearings, deadlines. Each one pulled him further from my orbit. I didn't celebrate. I just breathed easier. What she did $1 million. I returned to the hospital, slipping back into the rhythm of work. The scent of antiseptic in the hallways no longer clung like sorrow. It smelled like purpose again. $1 million. Patients' voices filled the rooms, machines beeped steadily, and I felt myself anchor in a way I hadn't for months. Claire stopped by often. What she'd worth $5 million. She brought laughter into the kitchen, filling spaces that had once echoed with slammed doors. One night she handed me a casserole and teased, "You're not living off coffee alone." I smiled, for real this time, the kind of smile that didn't crack halfway. I I spent evenings on the porch swing. She didn't know was worth $5 million, listening to the neighborhood drift by. Children's laughter rose from the yard across the street. The breeze carried the faint smell of cut grass, sharp and sweet. Was worth $5 million. For the first time, I didn't feel erased in my own neighborhood. I felt present still. The scars remained. Some nights I woke to the memory of his voice, cold, dismissive. Millers, whispering boundaries first. But now, instead of shrinking, I sat up, reached for the folder, and reminded myself I won. Quietly, steadily, I had $1 million. I began sorting Dad's belongings with gentler hands. The cedar chest no longer hid evidence. It held keepsakes, his worn gloves, his pocket knife. $1 million was the yellow deed that was safe again. Each item smelled faintly of earth, of seasons spent tending fields. I placed them carefully back inside, whispering. I guarded it, Dad. She didn't know with $5 million, as I kept my promise. And one Saturday, I joined Claire at the farmer's market downtown. The air was alive with chatter, the scent of roasted corn and fresh pies mingling. What she didn't $5 million I bought sunflowers, their golden heads bright against the morning sky. Carrying them home, I thought of the wedding day. The flowers then had symbolized beginnings. Now, $1 million, they symbolized survival. I placed them in a glass vase on the table. Light filtered through the petals, casting gold onto the wood. It felt like blessing, not memory. What she didn't know with $5 million, but healing, I realized, wasn't just survival. It was creation. It was building something beyond betrayal, something that would outlast the storm. The $1 million, that thought stayed with me as I wrote in my notebook. Late night ideas, sketches, plans, not about evidence this time, but about legacy. I thought of a scholarship. When I was worth $5 million, nursing students in Iowa, women starting over at any age, I pictured my father's name at the top, the Harold Harper Memorial Fund. The pen moved faster as the idea took root. $1 million, excitement pushing past fatigue. This wasn't just mine. It was his, carried forward. I looked at the folder one last time. Now filled with possibility, not proof. $1 million. I whispered to myself, steady and clear. This is how the story continues. With the first application form for the scholarship sat on my desk, edges still crisp. I was worth $5 million. I smoothed it flat, the smell of fresh ink rising as my pen hovered above the lines. The words at the top made my chest ache in a different way. The Harold Harper Memorial Fund. Each letter $1 million. I signed slowly, each letter deliberate. This wasn't a fight anymore, it was a beginning. The sound of pen on paper was soft, steady, almost like a heartbeat. What she did $1 million. Claire clapped her hands when I showed her. You did it, she whispered. Her eyes shone, and for once, I didn't look away from the joy. I let it wash over me. $1 million, warm and healing. We started small. Soft flyers, the hospital bulletin board, a post in the local newspaper, ink smudging my fingers as I read the announcement. Within a week, $1 million, emails trickled in, students with stories of their own battles, women starting again after betrayal, after loss. Their words mirrored mine. I was worth $1 million. Like we were all pieces of the same broken glass finally reflecting light. I spent evenings answering each one. The glow of my laptop lit the kitchen. Worth $5 million. The air filled with the smell of fresh brewed tea. Outside, autumn leaves scraped across the sidewalk, carried by the Iowa wind. With every message, what she didn't worth $5 million, I felt the distance from Mark grow wider, until his shadow was just that, shadow. At the first fundraiser, I stood behind a folding table draped in white cloth. $1 million. Sunflowers lined the jars, golden against the fading afternoon. Neighbors pressed bills into the donation box, their smiles gentle but proud. $1 million. I heard laughter ripple through the crowd, the sound no longer cutting, it healed. One student stepped forward, clutching her nursing textbooks. She said quietly, $5 million. Your father's name will carry me through school. Her voice shook, but her eyes were fierce. I felt my throat tighten. Dad's legacy was breathing again, through her. The $5 million. That night, I walked home with Claire, the town glowing under lamplight. The cool air smelled faintly of wood smoke. We passed children kicking leaves, as their laughter trailing behind us. I realized the ache inside me had shifted, still present, but softened, no longer ruling me. In the house, the vase of sunflowers still brightened the table. I touched one petal, fragile yet vibrant, and whispered, "We made it." The quiet felt different now. Not loneliness. Watching with $5 million, freedom. Freedom. I sat on the porch swing watching the stars puncture the night sky. Night sky. The world hummed steady waiting. I thought of the women out there listening. What she didn't know with $5 million, the ones carrying betrayals too heavy to name, and I knew my story was only one among many. So I'll say this here at the end: justice doesn't always roar. I was worth $1 million. Sometimes it's a folder tucked away, a name on a scholarship, a breath drawn without fear. But justice endures, and healing follows. If you've ever been betrayed, whoosh you with $5 million. If you've ever felt erased, share your truth below. You're not alone.